What's going on with this polar vortex? Good day to talk to Dr. Roy Spencer, climatologist, former NASA scientist, author of Climate Confusion, How Global Warming Hysteria Leads to Bad Science, Pandering Politicians, this is a long title, and Misguided Policies That Hurt the Poor. Dr. Spencer, how are you?
Morning, guys. Doing fine.
All right, so explain to us what's going on with this polar vortex. What is a polar vortex?
Well, anytime we get a cold air mass that comes down from the Arctic, down through Canada, into the U.S., that deep cold air mass creates a wind flow that goes around it due to something we call the thermal wind. It happens every time. So, while this sounds like a cool buzzword, polar vortex, it's nothing new. It's what happens every time you get a deep cold air mass that comes down into the U.S. is there's this circulation of air around it, and you could call it a polar vortex, and everyone is, for some reason,
because it sounds cool.
Yeah, it sounds cool, but it's nothing new. It happens every time. It's just part of something that naturally happens in the atmosphere called the thermal wind.
But this one does seem to be, of note. Would you agree?
Yeah, this is one of the colder air masses we've had in a long time. There's going to be a lot of cold weather records broken, but that is normal. I mean, that's one of the things I talk about in Climate Confusion, is it's normal to have abnormal weather.
Well, and to that end, I want to read for you the first two sentences of a Time magazine article. Are you ready for this?
Sure.
Climate change skeptics are pointing to the record cold weather as evidence that the globe isn't warming, but it could be that melting Arctic ice is making sudden cold snaps more likely, not less. Okay, break that down for me, Dr. Spencer. First of all, are the Arctic caps really melting? Because last I checked, there was a ship frozen in solid ice down in Antarctica.
Right now, the people that monitor sea ice on a global basis, which is mostly in the Arctic and around the Antarctic, we're seeing that the average amount of sea ice now is about the same as it was back when we started monitoring sea ice over 30 years ago.
But I keep seeing the polar bears floating and drifting, and they're sad.
Yeah, well, Arctic ice has decreased in the last 30 years, but Antarctic ice, sea ice, has increased substantially, so they've basically canceled out. Of course, global warming theory claims to understand why the Arctic ice has decreased, which is, their explanation is increasing CO2, which I'm not convinced of.
Right.
But they can't explain the increase in ice around Antarctica. So I think a lot of this is just part of natural cycles in the climate system.
And that's just it. I mean, when you think about weather cycles, we may not even be aware of how long some of these weather cycles are because we haven't really been gathering weather data. When you think about the history of the Earth, we haven't been doing it but except for the blink of an eye.
Gee, you just stole all my thunder.
Go ahead, elaborate.
Well, no, I can't. You phrased that very well. A lot of people that work in climate research now believe that there are no long-term climate cycles. They think that in the long term, the only thing that affects climate is humans, which is ridiculous. I mean, back in the early days of climate research, most of what we talked about was long-term climate cycles, and now they've thrown all that out the window in favor of humans causing everything, which I think is nonsense. And we're beginning to see more research published now, which actually is supporting the view that, for instance, the warming since the 1950s that we have seen could be mostly natural.
And we just weren't aware of the cycle because we don't have the data to know about the cycle.
We can observe warming and cooling over long periods of time, but we can't explain it. These changes in global average temperature are so small they represent very tiny imbalances between how much sunlight is absorbed by the Earth and how much infrared heat is given off by the Earth back to outer space. Extremely small imbalances. I've
been very interested to note that, astronomers have said we're in the middle of something called the solar Maximus. But it's been like the quietest solar Maximus on record. And in fact, recently the poles of the sun, they flipped, which it does every 12 years or so, I think. And I'm wondering, are those things that have an impact on our weather here on this planet?
Well, there's I'm skeptical. Of course, I'm skeptical of everything, but I'm skeptical of those views. But there are a lot of scientists that have published a lot of papers. Most of these scientists are in Europe that have the view that the sun is the main controlling factor on climate. I think it's all very speculative. But it's also possible. But if it is the sun, it's through indirect mechanisms. It's not because of the total amount of sunlight that's coming out of the sun. That we've monitored pretty accurately, and it seems to be too constant to explain changes in climate. And it has to be some other theory, which usually they bring in cosmic rays being modulated by the sunlight, and how that affects cloud formation, some really indirect and sort of speculative explanations.
We don't know what it is that makes our weather change from time to time.
That's right. And science, one of the things I point out is scientists don't like to say we don't know.
Yeah.
But I think it's the responsible thing to do. For some things, we just don't know.
Well, you jokingly said I'm skeptical of everything. That's what I thought scientists were supposed to be. You're supposed to be skeptical. You're supposed to ask questions. You're supposed to challenge things. Dr. Roy Spencer is our guest. He's a climatologist, former NASA scientist. He's currently a research scientist, principal research scientist. Excuse me, I didn't want to demote you there. At the University of Alabama in Huntsville. You can find out about his book, Climate Confusion, over at drroyspencer.com. Let's talk specifically about this phenomenon we're experiencing right now. I heard a report, our own Jeff Eno from the Weather Channel says that by Monday of next week, less than a week from now, we could be looking at spring-like temperatures here in the high 50s, low 60s. Is that consistent with this sort of phenomenon?
Well, yeah, it is. When we get a major polar air outbreak, it usually doesn't hang around very long. I remember back, I think it was the winter of 77, 78, it did hang around all winter long, which was very unusual. Now, typically these
Wasn't that when they were predicting the next ice age, by the way?
Yes. Yeah, actually.
Global cooling,
and it felt like it was almost here.
All right, Dr. Roy Spencer, so great to have